So now let's try to consider how to frame your research so that other people can understand that you are doing something important. So the first thing you need to realize is that communication is a social process, right? So by now, hopefully you are already identify a quite important research question that is clear, feasible, and impactful, right? But finding a worthy topic and a good research question important. At the same time, communicating your idea, what you are planning to do to others is as important, if not more important, right? So in this sense, you need to capture the interest of your audience. Right? If by presenting a research question or presenting what you plan to do, your audience is bored or confused, then you are wasting your time. So you need to present your message in a way that the audience can understand or relate to. Others won't know what you're trying to say unless you make it clear. Economics, as we have learned, can help with so many problems, especially behavior economics, can identify so many problems, help with so many problems. But if you are not able to communicate well, you will not be part of the solution. Right? So communication of your research idea is quite important, right? So this is something that I always suggest to my student who I supervise with their master or bachelor thesis. Right? So you might have a good idea and you might find you definitely would find it interesting yourself. But if you are not able to convey the interest to other people, to convince other people that you are doing something interesting, something important, then you will not be able to sell your research. You will not be able to earn a high grade for your thesis. And so it's actually quite important to be able to communicate well what you are trying to do is important. Right? Having a good research idea is, of course, one thing is important. At the same time, you need to convince other people that you are doing something important, something interesting. Then how would you structure your message so that other people would find it relevant and interesting? Well, it has been proven that certain message structure is more likely than others to grab people's attention. Right? So here are three important things that a persuasive message, an effective message will able to do. Right? So first, it confirm prior beliefs of the audience so that it will be able to increase acceptance. Right? Recall that we have discussed confirmation bias. Right? So people will try to seek evidence to confirm their prior beliefs. And they also interpret some new evidence to be consistent with their prior beliefs. Right? So because of this, if you present a message that directly contradicting with other people's belief, it's very difficult for them to find your message is persuasive. You are conveying some important information, right? So people tend to discredit a message if it is against their belief, right? So when they find some information against their belief, they will ask themselves the question, must I believe the message? I mean, it's very difficult to provide a positive answer to this question. Must I? Well, I do not need, do not have to believe anything, right? But if you are able to confirm their prior belief, they might change the question they ask themselves from must I believe this message to can I believe this message? So that is what you are doing by confirming people's prior belief. After you are able to confirm people's prior belief, you should highlight a problem to capture attention. So the problem would point out to the audience why they should care. And the problem should also be, of course, in order for them to care, the problem should be relevant to the audience. Right? Something you find interesting is not necessarily interesting to others. Relevance depends on the audience of your message. If you are presenting a term paper to someone that are interested in your topic, interested in your behavioral bias and behavioral economics, it may not be quite difficult for you to convince them that you are presenting something interesting, right? The difficulty is when you try to present your idea to someone, in another class who study humanity. So keep this in mind. Whether your topic is relevant depends on your audience, right? And you should try to reach the audience that are not in your inner circle, right? So they will consider your research as interesting no matter what, right? So you should try to aim to convince other people who are not that interested in behavioral economics that you are trying to do something important. And the third part of the message should present a solution to enhance the relevance. The best solution should be clear and actionable so that it can add value to message and maintain attention, right? So keeping these 3 points in mind, we will introduce the so-called narrative structure of persuasive message. So you may be wondering what narrative is, right? So narrative is related to the concept of story, and it refers to the series of events that occur in search for the solution to a problem, right? So you see this is actually consistent with the 3 points in the previous slide. All communication really begins with a simple challenge. This challenge would make what you present interesting. So this problem solution dynamic underpins everything from arguments and reasoning to the scientific method. Almost everything we do is about identify a topic, introducing a problem, then find a solution. Right? So that's the basics of the narrative structure. And we will soon formally introduce the structure of this message. Right? So here is a quote from the famous story consultant, Robert McKee. A great story creates a meaningful emotional experience for the audience through the use of conflict and resolution. So here is a summary of the essence of persuasive message. You should be able to identify a problem and offer a solution. Here, problem excites the brain as the arousal. It builds interest and gain attention. On the other hand, solution quiets the brain as the fulfillment. It will motivate action. So that's the two important part, problem and solution. But before presenting the problem and solution, you should need to first build an agreement so that you are able to reduce resistance. So basically, these are the 3 parts of the narrative structure of a persuasive message. Right? So these 3 parts of the narrative structure is consistent with the hero's journey proposed by the mythologist Joseph Campbell. Right? Joseph Campbell reviewed almost all the mythologies across all the cultures. And he find a common structure of all those mythologies, all the journeys of the heroes across different cultures. So the heroes in the mythologies, in the stories, in other words, usually go through 3 stages. First, the hero is start from the ordinary world. Everything is peaceful, nothing special, nothing eventful. And then some challenge occurs. A problem occurs. An issue arises, such that the hero cannot stay in the ordinary world. He has to face the challenge and try to solve the problem. So the problem, the issue, put the hero to the special world. Now it's not peaceful anymore. You have to face the conflict, and the conflicts are there that force the heroes to take action, right? And then the hero, in the process of solving this problem, is actually change his nature and character. And eventually the problem got solved. The hero got back to the ordinary world. Now everything is again peaceful, non-eventful, and it seems to be back to the original, but now the hero is actually a different person by going through the difficulties, the challenges. That's basically the common structure for the hero's journey that can be found in almost all the mythologies. Borrowing this idea of hero's journey, we can propose the ABT structure of a persuasive message. So ABT represent the three words and, but, therefore. And provide the context, the background, but present the problem, therefore offers the solution. ABT structure has been proven to be most effective compared to other alternative structures. And there are two other alternatives. The first structure is a boring AAA structure, right? So when you hear a young kid tell you a story, probably they will say, today I did this, and then I get up, and then there, and then he come, and then, and, right? So here, this and story is boring because there's no problem, there's no up and downs that excite and stimulate your brain, right? So you get bored, and then you lose interest. Another structure is called DHY, it's despite, however, yet. In this type of structure, it has too many turning points, right? So this is a structure that you could identify when you read some complicated academic papers. It's maybe the researchers, the writers, they want to demonstrate that they know how to think logically. They write these complicated sentences with different turning point, right? So it's very difficult for people to understand the logic. So ABD structure, in contrast to these two alternatives, it just have the right sweet spot, right? So it's just right in between. It's not boring, it's not confusing, right? So it just present one problem there to stimulate the brain, then that proves to be most effective. Right? So this ABD structure is just very similar to the so-called monomyth. Right? So the hero's journey proposed by Joseph Campbell. You start with the ordinary world, the end, that's at the context. Then you present the problem, you get into the special world, and then after the problem is solved by this corresponding solution, you get back to the ordinary world. So this three part, A and part, is just corresponding to the ordinary world, which provide the background, provide the agreement, everything is peaceful, and then the but part present the problem, right? So it illustrates the contradiction, put you or drag you into the special world. And the last part, the solution, therefore part, it provides the consequences, it gets you back to the ordinary world. Right? So the essence of ABT structure is just a framing of your message. Right? ABT frame your message so that you can get the audience pay attention to the information you want them to pay attention to. So what information to include and how to assemble it can get the attention of the audience. So that means in this ABT structure, in your presentation of the message, you should include only the information that serves the arc, the most important goal of your message, right? You should let the audience have the feeling of the hero faced with the problem. Then you become successful. Just as when we look at the hero's journey in the mythologies. Now, let's just elaborate, get into some more detailed discussion of the three part, but and therefore, ABT structure and but therefore. But we will start with but because the but part is the core of the message. It presents the problem, right? So the but part is just pointed out what the problem is. Well, there's a saying that no one would want to buy a solution without a problem, right? So in any message you want to present, you probably want to first get clear what is the major source of tension or conflict. Knowing your narratives begins with knowing your problem. If you are able to verbalize the problem, then you know the core of your message. Verbalizing a problem is the quickest way, the quickest path to simplicity. And but identify the problem, and the problem is the core of your ABT message. Here is you should pay attention that you should only have one narrative or single narrative in the ABT structure, meaning that you should have only one problem, a single problem, right? Because a single problem would point to one direction. And when you shift from one problem to two, then you would lose part of your audience because the two problem might be pointing to two different directions, and the audience may get confused, right? So you should start with finding a way to distill your many problems into one single overarching problem. And to help you with identify the center of a narrative, you can use the following statement. Nothing in the general topic, the general field, makes sense except in the light of something that you want to identify as the core of your message. Right? So here are some examples. I mean, this statement structure can help you to identify a narrative. But if you are already clear what the important problem is, what the corresponding narrative is, you don't have to go through this, right? But here are just some examples. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So here you see that evolution is a single narrative, is a quite important part when you try to discuss biology. And here, nothing in geology makes sense except in the light of plate tectonics. Nothing in the trade theory makes sense except in the light of comparative advantage. So this is a statement written by economists, you can see. Right? So talking about trade and comparative advantage and division of labor. Nothing at Apple computers makes sense except in the light of innovation. Right? So that emphasizes that innovation is the core part of the narrative. This may seem abstract. Here is an example illustrating what I mean by single narrative. So this is a message about genetics. Human impact put stress on wildlife population, and the populations need to be managed. But we need to know their genetics for management. Plus, the historical record is needed to see what's happening with the population growth. And also, wildfires are a new threat to wildlife that need to be considered. Therefore, we are implementing several new projects to address all these problems. So here is an example illustrating what I mean by single narrative. So this is a message about wildlife. Let's read this message, and as a convention, I mark the corresponding and part in blue, and the but part, the problem part, in red, and the therefore part, the solution part, in green. Human impacts put stress on wildlife populations, and the populations need to be managed. But we need to know their genetics for management. Plus, the historical record is needed to see what's happening with the population growth. And also, wildfires are a new threat to wildlife that needs to be considered. Therefore, we are implementing several new projects to address all these problems. In this message, it's point out several problems, right? So, but when you present the message, the readers, it's difficult to know which problem they should pay attention to, right? So, in contrast, the next message has a single narrative so that it points one direction so that the readers can easily identify which direction to look at to understand the seriousness of the problem. In this version, it reads, human impacts put stress on wildlife populations, and the populations need to be managed, the same as before, setting the context. But without knowing their genetics, it is difficult to make management decisions. Therefore, we are implementing several new projects to address all this problem. Right? So here, you see, it points out the problems of genetics, our lack of knowledge of the population genetics. Right? So it's a single narrative so that the readers can understand where their attention should be focused on. It's just a simple example, right? So in your research question, in the conveying of your message, you should know what is the most important problem, right? So you should identify a problem that you want to address, one problem you want to address. I mean, it's also the same for writing a research paper. Usually, a paper just present one problem that you aim to solve. Of course, you might along the way solve other problems, but that should not be the core of your message. So that is the but part, the problem part of the APT message. Now the end part. End part would set the context, right? So end part describes the ordinary world. It laid the groundwork, introduced the main character of the message. I'll explain what do I mean by main character, right? So it should give this plain, simple facts that everyone can agree on. This is our current state. Right? So basically that was this end part is saying. And you want to open your narrative with simple, broadly accepted pieces of information to which everyone can basically nod and reply, yes, we know this. Right? So if you are able to get this nod from the readers, then you are successful in this end part. So this end part, the context setting, opens a channel of communication and warms up the brain for the moment of contradiction in the brain, in the body part. Right? So that's the goal of the end part. Now let's get back to this definition of the main character. So the main character refers to what refers to the center of the narrative. Right? We need to mention the main character at the beginning and build the narrative around it. Right? So here is an example where the main character is not clearly defined, and then so it's difficult for us to sense the importance. Right? So let's read, and then you will understand better what I mean. In Asia, freshwater fish provide food for millions of people, and healthy fish population depend on healthy ecosystems. But freshwater habitats are severely threatened due to hydropower, urban expansion, pollution, and agriculture. Therefore, establishing sanctuary zones that protect fish habitats is vital for the future of sustainable fishery. Here, this end part did not clearly identify the main character. So it talk about all kinds of things, different characters. Is the main character freshwater fish or millions of people or ecosystem? It's not clear. But after you read the complete message, you realize that the author is trying to emphasize the importance of sanctuary zones. When the main character only appears towards the end of the message, it's difficult for the readers to establish this relationship, these feelings towards it. Right? It's much better if you start this narrative by mentioning the main character at the start so that you establish this idea that this main character is an important figure, important character. The following is an improved version where the main character is stated, is mentioned at the start, so that the readers at the beginning already has a feeling towards the main character. Right? So sanctuary zones have the ability to protect habitats and are credited with saving X billion in fishery resources. Right? So you see now you see the importance of sanctuary zones, right? But in Asia, they are not being implemented despite the widespread destruction of freshwater fish habitats due to hydropower, urban expansion, pollution, and agriculture. Therefore, we need to institute a program to begin creating sanctuary zone, right? So because you already mentioned the main character and point out the importance of the main character, it will be easier for people to realize what is at stake so that they are more likely to buy in your framing and to understand the importance of the corresponding problem. So one thing that you can do in this end part is to emphasize the stakes. One way to emphasize the stakes is to use if then. For example, this following message is a good ABT structure already. All right, so let's read this. This emphasizes why it is important to figure out these functions of individual neurons. Right? So the neurons involved in opioid production are located in one part of the brain and are involved in both pain and pleasure, a general fact. But we don't know which neurons are involved in which, a problem. Therefore, I try to figure this out for individual neurons. So this is just motivation of this research by this researcher. Right? So you can sense the problem, but the stakes, whether they are high or not, is difficult for the reader to sense. And what you can do is to add the following if-then sentences to emphasize the stake. So after saying the neurons involved in opioid production are located in one part of the brain and are involved in both pain and pleasure, right? So that's the general context, the background. And then you can add this if-then sentences to emphasize what is at stake. If we can figure out which individual neurons are involved with pleasure and distinguish them from the neurons involved with pain, then we can work on mechanisms to activate only the pain relieving neurons, which would bypass the pleasure part of the effect and thus reduce addiction. So now you see it's actually quite important to know the function, right? So you know what at stake, and by contrast, you will realize the seriousness of the problem. So if then, you can add it to this end part to emphasize stakes. Now, the last part, the therefore part. We have mentioned the but part, which pointed out the problem. And after the but part, we need to offer the solution. But is the word of contradiction in the ABT. Contradiction breaks the monotone and activate the brain. But our brain also have this need for closure. It has a desire for firm answer to a question and an aversion towards ambiguity. Therefore part offers a solution that suggests the action to take, right? So that's the importance of therefore part. Now, that's the ABT structure. You may be wondering whether it's effective. So the ABT structure is a general structure that you can observe everywhere for any kinds of effective communication. Take Hollywood, for example. If you check the great movies, all the great movies would follow the ABT structure. If you read novels, good fictions, those stories also follow this ABT structure. Indeed, the ABT structure was actually first formalized and popularized in the entertainment world by Hollywood screenwriters. And the popularization of the ABT structure is by Randy Olson. So he read many books on ABT structure. He was actually trained as a marine biologist, right? And then on his sabbatical, he actually takes some leave from the university and start to learn how to be a screenwriter in the Hollywood. And then he realized this ABT structure and realized that how bad scientists are at communicating their ideas. So that's why he tried to popularize this ABT structure among this academia. And if you look at great speeches across history, like the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, it follows exactly the ABT structure. I Have Dream by Martin Luther King it also follows this ABT structure, right? And the ABT structure also some predictions of the effectiveness of the speech of the message. So Randy Olson actually proposed this simple narrative index of messages. This index is a very coarse and rough index. It's basically just count the number of and in the message in the text and count the number of but. And then calculate the ratio of number of but divided by the number of and. Although this is a very rough and coarse measure, it can be illustrating and predicting the effectiveness of a message, right? So here is a list of the narrative index of different type of message. On the left is the maintenance manual, right? So the instruction manuals. Right? So you probably would understand that the maintenance and instruction manuals are quite boring because no one would read it for fun. It's just you just start to read it when you have some issues with using some appliance, right? So the ABT structure is seldomly used. It's basically this AAA structure. And predictably, the narrative index is very low for maintenance manual. And then we have these measures, the ABT index for different type of messages, right? So we have Stephen Douglas. You probably don't know who he is. He actually ran for presidency against Abraham Lincoln, right? And you see he's not that effective in measured by ABT structure. Abraham Lincoln actually is much more effective. I mean, that's probably one reason why Abraham Lincoln won this presidency, this president candidacy. And here we also interestingly have two other presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, right? So you probably don't like Donald Trump, but it's undeniable that his message is simple and also he know how to stimulate the brain by using the ABT structure, right? And the last one is a talk show comedian, Bill Maher, right? So you see that this a narrative index is very high, and that's why probably explains why people like to watch talk shows, right? Because it's funny, it's stimulate the brain, it's enjoyable. And here are more detailed illustration of this narrative index between these two president candidacy. Hopefully by now you're convinced that ABT is an effective structure to convey persuasive message, right? So in the slides, there are also some additional examples illustrating some additional tricks and tactics that you can use to make your ABT message more persuasive. So for the sake of time, you can just go through these on your own, right? So for example, you can try to make the end part to be a peaceful world without any conflict to contrast with the but part, right? And also you should pay attention that you should start with the main character in the end part to make it more effective. And also you can emphasize what is at stake using if-then sentences that can emphasize hope and also to contrast it with fear. Right? So here is an illustration. You can add this if-then in the end part to point out hope and add this if-then sentence at the bottom part to point out fear. This contrast would make it more dramatic, right? To understand the seriousness of the problem. You can also consider adding how after what in but and therefore to make it more clear what you are referring to. That's a brief discussion on how to structure your message, to describe your research, to convince other people that you are doing something important, right? And here's the homework for today. First, write down the research question of your term paper. Try to make it clear and feasible, right? As clear, as feasible as possible. And then after writing down the research question, use the ABT structure to demonstrate the importance of your term paper. Try to describe what your term paper does or what you plan to do for this term paper and explain why it is important to study your chosen topic. You should submit the APT description of your term paper along with your finalized title and research question. The deadline is the same as the term paper, right? But if you want to receive feedback from me, submit the finalized title, research question, and the APT description by the 11th of November, right? So it's not required. You can just wait until the 23rd, I believe, of November to submit everything. But if you want some feedback, try to do it early. I mean, because the feedback is important at the early stage of writing the term paper, so that you can just, try to refine your research question, try to polish what you plan to do. All right. Thanks for your attention. Enjoy writing your term paper.